The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he stepped off the train in Silver Creek, Arizona territory. The year was 1882, and the frontier town buzzed with the kind of energy that came from being on the edge of two worlds. Behind him lay the civilized East, where his family's cattle business had thrived for generations. Ahead stretched the wild territory where Apache bands still roamed free, where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card or the swing of a pickaxe. Jake had come west for one reason: to establish a new ranch operation that would supply beef to the growing mining camps scattered across the territory. At 28, he possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of working cattle and dealing with difficult men. His weathered hands told stories of long days in the saddle, and his steady gray eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the bustling main street of Silver Creek. The town clerk, a nervous man named Cornelius Webb, greeted Jake with enthusiasm tinged by obvious concern. "Mr. Morrison, we're mighty glad you're here. The territory needs men like you, men willing to invest in our future. But, I have to tell you straight, things ain't been easy lately." Webb's words proved prophetic over the following days as Jake learned the harsh realities of ranching in Apache country. The Chiricahua Apache, led by warriors like Geronimo, had been conducting raids throughout the region. Settlers lived in constant fear, and many had abandoned their claims entirely. The U.S. Army maintained a presence at nearby Fort Bowie, but the soldiers could not be everywhere at once. Despite the dangers, Jake saw opportunity where others saw only risk. The land was cheap precisely because of the Apache threat, and he had enough capital to wait out the troubles. He purchased a sprawling spread along Sulphur Creek, where good grass and water promised excellent grazing for cattle. The previous owner, a man named Hutchins, had fled after losing half his herd to raids. Jake's first priority was hiring reliable hands. This proved more difficult than expected, as most experienced cowboys had moved on to safer territories. He managed to recruit 5 men, a mix of drifters and locals desperate for work. Among them was Tom Brennan, a grizzled Irish immigrant who had fought in the Civil War and knew how to handle himself in dangerous situations. "Boss, you sure you want to do this?" Brennan asked as they surveyed the ranch headquarters, a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by a defensive wall. The Apache hit this place 3 times in the past 2 years. Killed old Hutchins' foreman and ran off near 200 head of cattle. Jake understood the risks, but he also understood cattle and land. The grass here was among the best he had seen, and Sulphur Creek ran year-round even during dry spells. If he could establish a secure operation, the profits would be substantial. The mining camps paid premium prices for fresh beef, and the railroad connection at Silver Creek made transportation feasible. The first month passed quietly as Jake and his men repaired buildings, mended fences, and prepared for the arrival of his cattle herd from Texas. He had arranged for 300 head of prime breeding stock, along with a dozen experienced drovers who would help establish the operation before returning south. It was during this period of relative calm that Jake first encountered the Apache people in a way that would change his understanding of the conflict entirely. He had ridden out alone to check on a distant water source, something Tom Brennan had specifically warned against. As he approached a natural spring hidden among cottonwood trees, he noticed fresh moccasin tracks in the sandy soil. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had heard enough stories about Apache stealth and fighting ability to know that if warriors wanted him dead, he would likely never see them coming. Instead, he continued toward the spring, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. The woman emerged from behind a large boulder with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with the strong features and dark eyes characteristic of the Apache people. Her clothing was a mix of traditional and acquired items, a buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, but also a wool shawl that had likely been traded or taken from Mexican or American sources. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the clearing. Jake had expected to encounter Apache warriors, not a young woman apparently alone at a remote spring. She showed no fear, only a watchful alertness that reminded him of a wild animal assessing potential danger. "Good water here," she said in English that was accented but clearly understood. "You come to take this too?" The question carried layers of meaning that Jake was only beginning to comprehend. He realized she was asking not just about the immediate water source, but about his intentions regarding Apache lands and resources. Her people had been forced to watch as their traditional territories were claimed by Mexican and American settlers, their ancestral springs and hunting grounds transformed into private property. "I came to check the water for my cattle," Jake replied honestly. "I bought land along Sulphur Creek. I didn't know this spring was used by your people." Something that might have been amusement flickered in her dark eyes. "Used by my people? This land was made by the spirits for all creatures. The white man's papers that say he owns the earth, this makes no sense to us." Jake found himself studying her face as she spoke. There was intelligence there, and a kind of dignity that impressed him more than he cared to admit. He had grown up hearing stories about savage Indians, but the woman before him displayed a composure and grace that challenged every stereotype he had absorbed. "What's your name?" he asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated before answering. "You would say Ayana. It means eternal blossom in your language. I'm Jake Morrison. I'm trying to build a ranch here, raise cattle. I don't want trouble with your people." Ayana's expression suggested that wanting to avoid trouble and actually avoiding it were very different things. "My people do not seek war for its own sake. But when our children go hungry while cattle eat the grass of our ancestors, when soldiers come to drive us from places sacred to our grandmothers, what would you do, Jake Morrison?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jake had never considered the conflict from the Apache perspective. To him and most settlers, the Indians were simply an obstacle to progress, a dangerous element to be removed or contained. But, as he looked into Ayana's intelligent eyes, he began to understand that there were human stories behind the newspaper headlines about savage raids and Indian depredations. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself returning to the spring more often than practical necessity required. Sometimes Ayana was there, sometimes not. When she was present, they talked about the land, the changes coming to the territory, and the deepening conflict between their peoples. She told him about Apache ways of thinking about land and animals, concepts that challenged his assumptions about ownership and use. Through these conversations, Jake learned that Ayana was the daughter of a respected warrior and medicine man named Ironshirt. Her band was part of the Chiricahua Apache, and they had been living in the Dragoon Mountains even as pressure mounted for all Apache groups to relocate to reservations. She had learned English from a Mexican trader who had married into the tribe, and her understanding of the white world was far more sophisticated than Jake had expected. "Your people see the land as something to be owned, divided, sold," she explained during one of their encounters. "To us, the land is our mother. You cannot own your mother. You can live with her, learn from her, take what she offers freely. But, own her? This is madness to us." These philosophical differences might have remained abstract if not for the practical realities pressing in around them. Jake's cattle had arrived from Texas, along with the additional hands needed to manage them. The operation was beginning to take shape, but tensions in the territory continued to escalate. News reached Silver Creek that Geronimo and his followers had broken out of the San Carlos reservation once again. General Crook was mobilizing troops to track them down, and rumors spread that major fighting was inevitable. Jake noticed increased military patrols in the area, and several of his neighbors began talking about forming local militia companies for mutual defense. The situation became personal when Tom Brennan brought word that Apache raiders had struck the Patterson Ranch 15 miles to the south. 2 cowboys had been killed and nearly 50 head of cattle driven off. The attack had occurred in broad daylight, suggesting that the Apache were becoming bolder or more desperate. "Boss, we need to talk serious about security," Brennan said as they stood in the ranch yard watching the cattle graze peacefully along the creek. "This ain't just about losing livestock anymore. They're killing folks now." Jake understood his foreman's concerns, but he found himself thinking about Ayana's words regarding hunger and desperation. What if the raids were not random acts of violence but responses to specific pressures? What if her people were truly facing starvation or displacement? These thoughts troubled him as he rode out to check on his herd the next morning. He had built his life around cattle ranching, and he understood better than most that livestock represented not just economic investment but survival itself. If settlers' cattle were grazing on traditional Apache food sources, if the presence of ranches was disrupting ancient patterns of hunting and gathering, then conflict was probably inevitable regardless of individual intentions. He was contemplating these difficult questions when he spotted smoke rising from the direction of the Patterson place. The black column climbed straight up in the still morning air, too thick and sustained to be anything other than a major fire. Jake spurred his horse toward the smoke, dreading what he might find. The Patterson Ranch headquarters had been thoroughly destroyed. Buildings smoldered in ruins, and the bodies of 3 men lay scattered around the yard. Jake recognized Patterson himself, along with 2 hands he had met in town. The cattle were gone, driven off by raiders who had clearly planned and executed the attack with military precision. As Jake surveyed the devastation, he noticed details that challenged the simple narrative of savage violence. The barn had been burned, but the house showed evidence of having been systematically searched rather than randomly destroyed. Personal items were scattered about, but valuable tools and equipment were missing rather than simply broken. Tom Brennan arrived with 2 other hands just as Jake was examining the tracks leading away from the ranch. The trail was clear enough, at least 20 horses heading north toward the Dragoon Mountains, driving the stolen cattle ahead of them. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Brennan muttered as he took in the scene. They're getting bold as brass now. Hid in broad daylight and took their sweet time about it. Jake studied the hoofprints in the sandy soil. Mixed among the unshod Apache horses were the tracks of shod animals, horses stolen from other raids or possibly Mexican stock acquired through trading. The complexity of the trail suggested a well-organized group operating with clear objectives rather than random raiders striking opportunistically. "We should report this to the army," suggested one of the hands, a young man named Collins who had been with the outfit less than a month. "Let them handle the tracking." Jake nodded, but privately he wondered if military pursuit would accomplish anything beyond escalating the violence. Army tactics involved chasing Apache bands across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain terrain where the Indians held every advantage. More often than not, such pursuits ended with soldiers shooting at shadows while the Apache vanished into landscape they had known since childhood. As they rode back toward Silver Creek to report the attack, Jake found his thoughts returning to Ayanna and their conversations about hunger and desperation. If her people were truly facing starvation, then raids like this represented survival rather than aggression. But 3 men were dead, and their families would want justice or revenge. That evening, as Jake sat on the porch of his ranch house looking out over his own cattle peacefully grazing in the fading light, he realized that his simple plan to establish a successful ranching operation had become entangled in forces much larger than business concerns. The conflict between settlers and Apache was entering a new phase, one that would likely determine the future of the entire territory. The sound of approaching horses broke his reverie. Tom Brennan rode into the yard followed by a dust-covered army sergeant and 2 troopers. The sergeant, a career soldier with the weathered look of long frontier service, dismounted stiffly and approached the porch. "Mr. Morrison? I'm Sergeant Kelly from Fort Bowie. We're investigating the raid on the Patterson place. Heard you found the bodies." Jake provided a detailed account of what he had observed, including his assessment of the tracks and the apparent organization of the attack. Sergeant Kelly listened carefully, occasionally asking specific questions about details that suggested professional military interest rather than mere curiosity. "We'll be putting together a pursuit column tomorrow," Kelly explained. "General Crook wants these raiders tracked down and punished. Too many good men have died already." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Kelly paused and looked directly at Jake. "Word is you've been seen talking to Apache individuals near your property. That true?" The question hung in the evening air like an accusation. Jake felt the eyes of his own men upon him, waiting to see how he would respond. He understood that his answer might determine not only his relationship with the army but his standing in the entire settler community. "I've encountered Apache people a few times," he said carefully. "They use some of the same water sources as my cattle. We've talked, but nothing more than that." Kelly's expression suggested that he suspected there was more to the story. "These people you've talked to, do they say anything about raids or plans against settlers?" Jake shook his head truthfully. Ayanna had never mentioned specific military activities, and their conversations had focused on broader philosophical and cultural differences rather than tactical information. "Well, keep your eyes open," Kelly advised. "Intelligence suggests major trouble ahead. Geronimo's got more followers than we initially thought, and they're better armed than previous reports indicated. This territory's heading for a real war, and every man's going to have to choose sides." After the soldiers rode away, Jake sat alone on his porch as full darkness settled over the land. Kelly's words echoed in his mind: every man would have to choose sides. But what if a man found himself sympathetic to both sides? What if the conflict was more complex than simple good versus evil? He thought about Patterson and his hands, good men trying to build something lasting in difficult country. Their deaths were a genuine tragedy that demanded justice. But he also thought about Ayanna's people, facing the loss of their ancestral lands and traditional way of life. Their desperation was equally real and equally tragic. The next morning brought news that would force Jake to confront these conflicting loyalties sooner than expected. Tom Brennan rode in from town with word that the Army patrol had found fresh Apache sign near the disputed spring where Jake had been meeting with Ayanna. Worse, they had found evidence of a recent camp that suggested a significant group had been using the area regularly. "Sergeant Kelly's asking hard questions about your visits to that spring, boss," Brennan reported. "Some folks in town are wondering if you might have been passing information to the wrong people." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. The suggestion that he might be collaborating with raiders responsible for the deaths of his neighbors was both insulting and dangerous. In frontier communities, suspicion of disloyalty could destroy a man's reputation and livelihood as effectively as any Apache raid. But, as Jake considered his response, he realized that the truth was more complicated than simple denial could address. He had indeed been meeting with an Apache woman, and he had developed genuine respect for her intelligence and perspective. If that constituted disloyalty in the eyes of his neighbors, then perhaps the problem lay not with his actions but with their understanding of the situation. Jake Morrison's reputation in Silver Creek began to suffer almost immediately. Word spread quickly through the small frontier community that the new rancher had been seen talking with Apache individuals near his property. In a town where families lived in constant fear of raids, such associations were viewed with deep suspicion. The first sign of trouble came when Jake tried to purchase supplies at Henderson's general store. The proprietor, normally eager for business from successful ranchers, served him with obvious reluctance and refused to extend credit that had been freely offered just weeks earlier. "Nothing personal, Morrison," Henderson explained, avoiding eye contact. "But folks are talking. With things heating up like they are, a man's got to be careful about his associations." Similar treatment awaited Jake at the bank, the blacksmith shop, and the saloon. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms, and men he had counted as potential friends now regarded him with wary suspicion. The transformation was swift and thorough, demonstrating how quickly frontier communities could close ranks against perceived threats. Tom Brennan proved loyal, but even he expressed concerns about the situation. "Boss, I've stood by men through all kinds of trouble, but this is different. If the Army thinks you're passing information to hostiles, they could arrest you as a traitor. And if your neighbors think the same thing." He left the sentence unfinished, but Jake understood the implications. Frontier justice was swift and harsh, particularly when applied to those suspected of collaboration with Indian raiders. Men had been hanged on less evidence than currently circulating about Jake's activities. Despite the growing pressure, Jake found himself returning to the spring where he had first encountered Ayanna. He told himself he was checking on his cattle's water supply, but honesty compelled him to admit deeper motivations. The Apache woman represented a perspective on the conflict that challenged everything he had been raised to believe about civilization and progress. She was waiting for him when he arrived at the Cottonwood Grove, but her manner had changed significantly. Where before she had seemed relaxed and open to conversation, now she appeared tense and watchful. Her dark eyes scanned the surrounding terrain continuously, and Jake noticed she stayed closer to cover that would allow rapid escape. "You should not come here anymore," she said without preamble. "My people know of our meetings. Yours know as well. This brings danger to both of us." Jake dismounted and approached slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her words but reluctant to sever their connection. Through their conversations, he had begun to understand the Apache perspective on the conflict in ways that complicated his simple view of right and wrong. "The soldiers came asking questions," he said. "They found signs of your people camping near here." Ayanna nodded gravely. "Iron Shirt's band has used this place for water and counsel. It has been sacred to us for generations beyond counting. Now your soldiers call it evidence of hostile activity." The irony was not lost on Jake. The spring that had brought them together was also becoming the source of suspicion that threatened to drive them apart. He found himself caught between loyalty to his own community and growing understanding of Apache grievances. "3 men died at the Patterson Ranch," Jake said carefully. "Good men with families. People want justice. And what justice is there for Apache children who starve while cattle eat the grass of their ancestors?" Ayanna replied, her voice carrying pain alongside defiance. "What justice for grandmothers driven from burial places of their own grandmothers?" Jake had no easy answer for her questions. The moral complexity of the situation defied simple solutions or clear villains. Both sides had legitimate grievances, and both sides had committed acts that could be labeled either necessary survival or inexcusable violence, depending on one's perspective. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Ayanna melted into the brush with the speed of a startled deer, leaving Jake alone as 4 riders emerged from the trees. He recognized Sergeant Kelly from Fort Bowie, along with 3 troopers who had their rifles ready for immediate use. "Mr. Morrison," Kelly said, his voice carrying official authority. "Interesting place for a cattleman to be checking his herd." Jake forced himself to remain calm despite the accusatory tone. "My cattle use this water regularly. I like to make sure the source stays clean." Kelly dismounted and examined the area around the spring with the practiced eye of a professional soldier. He pointed to moccasin tracks in the sandy soil, some of which were clearly fresh. "These belong to your cattle?" The sarcasm was obvious, but Jake refused to be baited into an argument that would only make his situation worse. "I've never claimed to be the only one who uses this water source." One of the troopers, a young man with the eager look of someone hoping to prove himself in combat, spoke up. "Sergeant, those tracks ain't more than a day old. Could be scouts watching our movements." Kelly nodded thoughtfully. "Could be. Could also be someone passing information about our patrol schedules and strength." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Jake understood that he was being given an opportunity to explain himself, but he also recognized the danger in saying too much. Admitting to regular meetings with Apache individuals would likely result in immediate arrest, but denying all contact might be proven false if the soldiers had additional information. "I've encountered Apache people a few times," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Brief meetings, nothing more. I've never discussed military matters or provided any information that could be used against settlers or soldiers." Kelly studied Jake's face with the intensity of a man trained to read deception. "These encounters, they happen to occur at this particular spring?" Jake nodded reluctantly. "Sometimes." "And the Apache individual you've been meeting, would that be a warrior? A woman? Someone with apparent authority in their community?" The specificity of the questions suggested that Kelly already knew more than he was revealing. Jake wondered if soldiers had been watching the spring, or if someone else had reported his activities in greater detail than he had realized. "A woman," he admitted. "She seemed intelligent and spoke good English. We talked about land use and the conflict in general terms." Kelly exchanged glances with his men. "This woman have a name?" Jake hesitated before answering. Revealing Ayanna's identity could put her in immediate danger if the army decided to track her down for interrogation. But refusing to answer would likely result in his own arrest on suspicion of collaboration. "She called herself Ayanna," he said finally. The effect on Kelly was immediate and dramatic. The sergeant's posture stiffened, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. The troopers likewise showed increased alertness, as if Jake had just revealed himself to be an armed enemy. "Ayanna?" Kelly repeated. Daughter of Iron Shirt? Jake's heart sank as he realized the implications of the sergeant's recognition. Ayanna was not simply a random Apache woman, but someone specifically known to the military authorities. Her family connections made their meetings far more significant than casual encounters between strangers. I don't know her family connections, Jake said, technically truthful but, knowing his answer sounded evasive. Kelly's expression had hardened into official suspicion. Mr. Morrison, Iron Shirt is one of Geronimo's principal war leaders. His daughter would have access to information about Apache plans and movements. Your meetings with her constitute contact with confirmed hostiles. The label confirmed hostiles transformed Jake's perception of the situation entirely. In the military's view, he had not been engaging in philosophical discussions with an interesting individual, but conducting potentially treasonous communications with the enemy. The distinction between civilian conversation and military intelligence became meaningless when applied to wartime conditions. I never asked for or received any military information, Jake protested. Our conversations were about general topics, land use, cultural differences, the nature of the conflict. The nature of the conflict, Kelly repeated. That's exactly the kind of strategic intelligence that would be valuable to Apache war leaders planning their next operations. Jake began to understand how easily innocent actions could be reinterpreted as sinister when viewed through the lens of military suspicion. His genuine attempt to understand different perspectives had been transformed into evidence of collaboration with the enemy. Sergeant, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of these meetings, Jake said. I'm a cattleman trying to build a ranch. I have no interest in military or political matters beyond protecting my own property and livestock. Kelly's laugh held no humor. Mr. Morrison, whether you understand it or not, you've been participating in intelligence-gathering operations with one of the most dangerous Apache families in the territory. Iron Shirt's band has been responsible for at least 6 major raids in the past 2 months, including the attack on the Patterson Ranch. The revelation struck Jake like a physical blow. If Ayanna's family had been involved in the raid that killed Patterson and his men, then his conversations with her took on an entirely different character. Had she been gathering information about rancher activities and vulnerabilities? Had their philosophical discussions been elaborate cover for military reconnaissance? I had no knowledge of any connection between our conversations and specific raids, Jake said, hearing the weakness in his own voice. Maybe not, Kelly conceded. But ignorance isn't a defense when American lives are at stake. You've been meeting regularly with the daughter of a confirmed hostile war leader during a period of active conflict. That requires official investigation. Jake realized that his situation had moved beyond local suspicion to federal military concerns. The Army had authority to deal with suspected collaborators using methods far more severe than community ostracism or economic pressure. What happens now? He asked. Kelly considered the question carefully. You're not under arrest yet, but you are under investigation. You will report to Fort Bowie tomorrow morning for formal questioning by Major Williams. You will answer all questions truthfully and completely. And you will have no further contact with any Apache individuals, hostile or otherwise. The conditions were clear and non-negotiable. Jake understood that his freedom and possibly his life depended on convincing Major Williams that his meetings with Ayanna had been innocent of any treasonous intent. After the soldiers rode away, Jake remained at the spring trying to process what had just occurred. In the space of a single conversation, his understanding of recent events had been completely transformed. The intelligent, dignified woman with whom he had discussed philosophy and cultural differences was apparently the daughter of one of the most feared Apache war leaders in the territory. The ride back to his ranch gave him time to consider the implications. If Ayanna had indeed been gathering intelligence during their meetings, then he had been played for a fool by someone far more sophisticated than he had realized. But if their conversations had been genuine attempts at cross-cultural understanding, then both of them were now in danger because of military and community paranoia. Tom Brennan met him at the ranch gate with news that further complicated an already difficult situation. Boss, we had visitors while you were out. 3 men from town, led by Samuel Morrison, no relation, I assume. They wanted to know if you were planning to stay in the territory or if you might be looking to sell out. The inquiry represented a not-so-subtle suggestion that Jake's continued presence might not be welcome in the community. If his neighbors were already discussing his potential departure, then, his reputation had deteriorated even faster than he had realized. "What did you tell them?" Jake asked. "Told them you were committed to making the ranch work and had no intention of being driven off by gossip and rumors," Brennan replied. "But, boss, I have to tell you, the men are getting nervous. They signed on to work cattle, not to be associated with someone suspected of collaborating with hostiles." Jake understood his foreman's concerns. Cowboys were independent by nature, and they would not remain loyal to an employer whose reputation might endanger their own standing in the community. If he could not resolve the suspicions surrounding his activities, he might find himself alone on a ranch that required multiple hands to operate successfully. That evening, as Jake prepared for his appearance at Fort Bowie, he reflected on the choices that had led him to this point. His decision to engage in conversation with Ayanna had seemed natural and harmless at the time. Their discussions had been intellectually stimulating and had challenged his assumptions about the conflict in ways that seemed valuable. But he was beginning to understand that in wartime, intellectual curiosity could be mistaken for disloyalty, and attempts at understanding different perspectives could be interpreted as collaboration with the enemy. The complexity and nuance that had attracted him to their conversations were precisely the qualities that military authorities found most suspicious. As he sat on his porch looking out over the cattle that represented his investment in the territory's future, Jake realized that his next 24 hours would likely determine not only his business prospects but his basic freedom. Major Williams would want clear answers to difficult questions, and Jake was not certain he could provide explanations that would satisfy military concerns while remaining true to his own understanding of what had occurred. The sound of night birds calling across the darkness reminded him that other dramas were playing out in the territory beyond his own troubles. Somewhere in the mountains, Apache families were making their own difficult choices about survival and resistance. Soldiers were planning operations that would determine the fate of entire communities. Settlers were deciding whether to stay and fight for their claims or abandon their dreams and flee to safer territories. Jake Morrison, who had come to Arizona Territory seeking nothing more than good grazing land and profitable markets for beef cattle, found himself at the center of forces that would shape the future of the American Southwest. His decision to engage with Ayanna had seemed like a small matter of personal curiosity. Now he was learning that in times of conflict, there were no small matters, and every choice carried consequences that extended far beyond individual intentions. Fort Bowie appeared out of the desert heat like a mirage made of adobe and determination. The military post commanded a strategic position guarding Apache Pass, the crucial mountain route that connected the eastern and western portions of Arizona Territory. As Jake Morrison rode through the main gate, he could see why the Army had chosen this location. The fortification provided clear views in all directions while controlling access to vital water sources in the surrounding mountains. Major Samuel Williams proved to be a career soldier with the weathered appearance of a man who had spent decades dealing with frontier conflicts. His office was spartanly furnished but organized with military precision. Maps of the territory covered one wall, marked with colored pins indicating recent Apache activity, military patrol routes, and settler communities. Jake noticed that his own ranch was marked with a red pin, apparently indicating a location of special interest. "Mr. Morrison, please sit down," Williams said, gesturing to a wooden chair positioned directly across from his desk. "I want to discuss your recent activities in detail." The major's tone was professionally neutral, but Jake sensed the underlying tension of a man responsible for containing a dangerous situation. Williams had been fighting Apache bands for over 15 years, and his experience showed in the way he approached problems, methodically, thoroughly, and with complete focus on practical results. "I understand you've had multiple encounters with Apache individuals near your property," Williams began, consulting notes that suggested previous investigation. "Specifically with a woman calling herself Ayanna." Jake nodded, wondering how much the Army already knew about his activities. "That's correct, sir. We've met several times at a spring that provides water for my cattle." Williams leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the nature of these meetings. How did they begin? What subjects did you discuss?" Jake provided a careful account of his encounters with Ayanna, emphasizing the philosophical nature of their conversations while avoiding details that might further incriminate either of them. He described their discussions of land use, cultural differences, and the general nature of the conflict between settlers and Apache people. "She spoke excellent English," Williams observed. "That's unusual for Apache women of her generation." Did she explain how she acquired such language skills? "She mentioned learning from a Mexican trader who had married into her tribe," Jake replied honestly. Williams made a note in his file. "That would be Miguel Sandoval, a man we've been tracking for 2 years. He's suspected of supplying weapons and ammunition to hostile bands in exchange for stolen cattle and horses." The revelation added another layer of complexity to Jake's situation. If Ayanna had learned English from someone suspected of arms dealing, then her linguistic abilities took on potential military significance rather than simple cultural interest. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand something," Williams said, setting down his pen and looking directly at Jake. "Ayanna is not simply the daughter of a prominent Apache leader. Our intelligence indicates she serves as an interpreter and negotiator for her father's band. She's been present at several councils where Apache groups coordinated their military activities." Jake felt his understanding of recent events shifting once again. The woman he had seen as an intelligent individual interested in cross-cultural dialogue was apparently a key figure in Apache political and military organization. Their conversations had been far more significant than casual meetings between curious strangers. "Major, I had no knowledge of her political role among her people," Jake said. "Our discussions never touched on specific military matters or operational details." "Perhaps not directly," Williams replied. "But consider what she could have learned from your conversations. Details about your ranch operations, the number of hands you employ, your security precautions, your relationships with neighboring ranchers, all valuable intelligence for planning raids." Jake realized that even innocent conversation could provide tactical information to someone trained to gather intelligence. His description of routine ranch activities might have revealed patterns of movement and vulnerability that could be exploited by raiders. "Did she ever ask specific questions about your livestock numbers, work schedules, or security arrangements?" Williams continued. Jake thought carefully before answering. Ayanna had asked about his cattle and ranch operations, but her questions had seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than intelligence gathering. However, he was beginning to understand that the distinction might be meaningless from a military perspective. "She asked general questions about cattle ranching and my plans for the operation," he admitted. "But nothing that seemed focused on security matters." Williams consulted his notes again. "Mr. Morrison, 3 days after your last confirmed meeting with this woman, Apache raiders struck the Patterson Ranch with what our investigation suggests was detailed knowledge of the property layout and defensive preparations. They knew exactly where to find the ranch hands and how to avoid the locations Patterson had prepared for defense. The timing was damning, and Jake felt the walls of suspicion closing around him. Even if he had not intentionally provided intelligence, his conversations with Ayanna had occurred immediately before a raid that demonstrated sophisticated advance planning. "Major, I understand how this looks," Jake said, choosing his words carefully. "But I never discussed the Patterson Ranch with her. I barely knew Patterson myself." "That may be true," Williams replied. "But Apache intelligence networks are more sophisticated than most people realize. Information you provided about general ranching practices and security concerns could have been combined with other sources to produce detailed operational intelligence." Jake was beginning to understand the complexity of the military situation facing Williams and his command. The Apache were not simply conducting random raids but operating with coordinated intelligence networks that allowed them to strike specific targets with maximum effectiveness. In such a context, any contact between settlers and Apache individuals became potential security risks. "What I need to determine," Williams continued, "is whether your meetings with this woman were the result of naive curiosity or deliberate collaboration. The distinction is crucial for deciding how to proceed." The question hung between them like an ultimatum. Jake understood that his answer would determine not only his immediate fate but his future in the territory. If Williams concluded that he had been deliberately collaborating with hostiles, military justice would be swift and severe. "Major, I came to this territory to build a cattle ranch, nothing more," Jake said with all the conviction he could muster. "I've never had any political agenda or sympathy for hostile activities. My meetings with this woman began by accident and continued out of curiosity about Apache perspectives on the conflict. I never intended to provide intelligence or assist in any military activities." Williams studied Jake's face with the intensity of a man trained to detect deception. The silence stretched between them as the Major weighed the evidence against Jake's protestations of innocence. "Mr. Morrison, I'm inclined to believe that you stumbled into this situation without understanding its implications," Williams said finally. "However, the results are the same regardless of your intentions. You've had extensive contact with a key intelligence operative for one of the most dangerous Apache bands in the territory." Jake felt a mixture of relief and continued apprehension. Williams seemed prepared to accept his explanation of innocent involvement, but the Major's tone suggested that serious consequences might still follow. "What happens now?" Jake asked. Williams stood and walked to the map-covered wall, pointing to the location of Jake's ranch. "Your property sits in a strategically important area. The spring where you've been meeting this woman controls access to several mountain trails used by Apache raiders. We need to establish a military presence in that area." Jake began to understand the direction of Williams' thinking. The Army wanted to use his ranch as a base for operations against Apache bands, transforming his cattle operation into a military outpost. "I'm prepared to cooperate with military operations," Jake said carefully, uncertain of the full implications of such cooperation. "Cooperation isn't optional in this case," Williams replied. "Under territorial law, we have authority to requisition private property for military use during active hostilities. However, I'd prefer to work with you voluntarily." The choice Williams presented was between voluntary cooperation and military seizure of his property. Jake understood that either option would fundamentally change the nature of his ranching operation. "What would such cooperation involve?" he asked. Williams returned to his desk and pulled out a detailed map of Jake's property. "We want to establish a patrol base at your ranch headquarters. 20 soldiers under a lieutenant's command, with rotating patrols covering the surrounding area. Your ranch would serve as their supply point and communications center." Jake studied the map, recognizing both opportunities and problems in the Major's proposal. A military presence would provide security for his cattle and operations, but it would also make his ranch a target for Apache attacks. More importantly, it would end any possibility of further contact with Ayanna, even if such contact had been advisable. "The soldiers would be there permanently?" Jake asked. "For the duration of active hostilities," Williams replied. "Could be months, could be years. Depends on how long it takes to resolve the Apache situation." Jake realized that accepting Williams' proposal would transform his ranch from a cattle operation into a frontier military post. The change would provide security but would also alter his relationship with neighboring ranchers and the broader community. "Major, I need to consider the implications for my livestock and operations," Jake said. Williams nodded understandingly. "Of course. But I need your decision quickly. Recent intelligence suggests that major Apache activity is planned for this area. We can't afford to leave strategic positions undefended." As Jake prepared to leave Fort Bowie, Williams added a final warning that clarified the seriousness of his situation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt regarding your past activities. But any future contact with Apache individuals, particularly with Ayanna or members of her family, will be considered evidence of deliberate collaboration. Such evidence would result in immediate arrest and trial for treason." The warning was unmistakably clear. Jake's freedom depended on severing all connections with the Apache world that had begun to fascinate him. He could no longer claim ignorance or innocent curiosity as protection for actions that the military viewed as potentially treasonous. The ride back to his ranch gave Jake time to consider his limited options. He could accept Williams' proposal and transform his property into a military outpost, providing security but fundamentally altering his original vision for the operation. He could refuse military cooperation and face seizure of his property under territorial law. Or he could abandon his investment entirely and seek opportunities in less volatile regions. None of the options appealed to him, but Jake was beginning to understand that frontier life often required choosing between unsatisfactory alternatives rather than pursuing ideal solutions. The romantic vision of independent ranching that had drawn him west was colliding with the harsh realities of territorial conflict and military necessity. Tom Brennan met him at the ranch gate with news that further complicated his decision.
"Boss, we had more visitors while you were gone. Ayanna came looking for you, said it was urgent that she speak with you immediately."
Jake's heart raced as he considered the implications. If Ayanna had been seen at his ranch during his absence, military observers might have documented additional evidence of contact between them. Her presence would certainly be reported to Major Williams, possibly invalidating the tentative trust the Major had extended.
"Did anyone else see her?"
Jake asked. "Don't think so," Brennan replied.
"But she left a message. Said to tell you that Iron Shirt wants to meet with you personally. Tonight at the old mine shaft up canyon from the spring."
The invitation represented exactly the kind of contact that Major Williams had forbidden. Meeting with Iron Shirt, one of the most wanted Apache war leaders in the territory, would constitute undeniable evidence of collaboration with hostile forces. Discovery of such a meeting would result in immediate arrest and likely execution as a traitor. But Jake found himself intensely curious about what Iron Shirt might want to discuss. If the Apache leader was willing to risk exposure for a meeting, the subject matter was probably significant. Perhaps the conversation could provide insights that might help resolve the broader conflict in ways that military force could not achieve. As evening approached, Jake faced the most important decision of his life. He could ignore Iron Shirt's invitation and report it to Major Williams, demonstrating loyalty to the military authorities while potentially missing an opportunity for genuine peacemaking. Or he could honor the meeting and risk everything he had worked to build in pursuit of understanding that might prove impossible to achieve. The choice would determine not only his own fate but potentially influence the course of a conflict that was tearing apart the entire territory. As darkness settled over the land, Jake Morrison prepared to make a decision that would define his character and shape his future in ways he could barely imagine. Jake Morrison stood at the crossroads of his conscience as the sun disappeared behind the Dragoon Mountains. The abandoned mine shaft lay 3 miles up the canyon from the spring where he had first met Ayanna, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through jumbled boulders and thorny desert vegetation. Going there would violate Major Williams' explicit orders and place him in mortal danger from both Apache warriors and American soldiers. Yet something deeper than curiosity drove him toward that fateful meeting. Through his conversations with Ayanna, Jake had glimpsed the human complexity behind the newspaper stories of savage raids and Indian depredations. He had begun to understand that the conflict consuming the territory involved real people making desperate choices rather than simple heroes and villains.
The decision crystallized as he saddled his horse in the gathering darkness.
Tom Brennan watched silently, understanding that his employer was contemplating something that could destroy them all. The foreman had served Jake loyally, but loyalty had limits when survival was at stake.
"Boss, whatever you're thinking about doing, think twice," Brennan said quietly.
A man can only push his luck so far before it runs out entirely. Jake appreciated the warning but could not explain his compulsion to honor Iron Shirt's invitation. Something about Ayanna's urgency suggested that this meeting might represent a last chance for understanding between peoples who seemed destined for mutual destruction. "If I'm not back by dawn, send word to Major Williams," Jake instructed. "Tell him I went to investigate Apache activity near the old mine and never returned." Brennan nodded grimly, understanding that such a message would at least preserve Jake's reputation as a loyal citizen rather than a suspected traitor.
"Good luck, boss. You're going to need it." The ride through moonlit desert terrain gave Jake time to consider what he might be walking into. Iron Shirt had built a fearsome reputation as both a warrior and a strategic leader. If this meeting was some kind of trap designed to eliminate a potential intelligence source, Jake would likely never be seen again. But if the Apache leader genuinely sought dialogue, the conversation might provide insights that could save lives on both sides. The old mine shaft had been abandoned for over a decade after a cave-in killed 3 Mexican prospectors. Local superstition held that the spirits of the dead miners still haunted the site, making it an ideal location for clandestine meetings. As Jake approached the rocky outcropping that concealed the entrance, he noticed a small fire flickering deep within the shaft. Iron Shirt emerged from the shadows like a materializing ghost. The Apache war leader appeared to be in his 50s, with the lean build and alert bearing of a man who had spent his life in constant danger. His clothing was practical rather than ceremonial: buckskin leggings, cotton shirt, and a military-style hat that had probably been taken from a dead soldier. "You came," Iron Shirt said in English that was accented but clear. "This shows either courage or foolishness. Perhaps both." Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his rifle secured to demonstrate peaceful intentions. "Your daughter said you wanted to speak with me. Here I am." Iron Shirt studied Jake with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Ayana tells me you are different from other white men. She says you listen instead of just talking. Is this true?" The question carried weight beyond simple courtesy. Jake understood that Iron Shirt was assessing whether meaningful communication was possible or whether this meeting would prove to be another futile attempt at dialogue between incompatible worldviews. "I try to understand different perspectives," Jake replied honestly. "Your daughter has taught me things about this conflict that I never learned from newspapers or army reports." Iron Shirt nodded approvingly. "The newspapers lie. The army lies. They say we are savage animals who kill for pleasure. They do not say why we fight." Jake remained silent, understanding that Iron Shirt needed to speak his truth before any meaningful dialogue could begin. The Apache leader gestured toward the fire, and they sat facing each other across the flickering flames like negotiators from opposing armies. "For generations beyond counting, my people have lived in these mountains," Iron Shirt began. "We know every spring, every cave, every trail. The spirits of our ancestors are buried in this soil. Our children learned to walk on these rocks. This land is not just our home, it is our soul." Jake listened as Iron Shirt described the systematic destruction of Apache life that had preceded the current conflict. Mexican and American settlers had claimed traditional hunting grounds, soldiers had destroyed sacred sites, and government officials had made promises they never intended to keep. From the Apache perspective, their raids were defensive actions against invaders who had stolen everything of value. "Your people see only the violence," Iron Shirt continued. "They do not see the children who starve because cattle eat the grass where we once gathered food plants. They do not see the grandmothers who weep because soldiers have defiled the burial places of their mothers." The Apache leader's words painted a picture of cultural genocide that newspapers never reported. Jake began to understand that what settlers saw as opening the frontier appeared to Apache people as the systematic destruction of their entire way of life. "But, you have killed innocent people," Jake said carefully. "Ranchers like Patterson were just trying to make a living, same as your people." Iron Shirt's expression hardened. "Patterson was not innocent. He built his ranch on the site where my grandfather is buried. When we asked him to move his cattle from the sacred ground, he laughed and threatened to have soldiers drive us away. What would you do if someone built a barn over your father's grave?" The revelation transformed Jake's understanding of the Patterson raid completely. What he had seen as random violence was actually a response to specific desecration of Apache sacred sites. The complexity of the situation defied simple judgments about guilt and innocence. "Your soldiers do not distinguish between warriors and children," Iron Shirt continued. "Last month they attacked a camp where women were gathering acorns for winter food. 5 children died, including my own grandson. Where is the justice in this?" Jake had heard no military reports of attacking non-combatant camps, but he was beginning to understand that official accounts often omitted details that might complicate public support for military operations. Both sides in the conflict were capable of atrocities, and both sides justified their actions through narratives that emphasized their own victimization. "Why did you want to meet with me?" Jake asked, sensing that Iron Shirt was approaching the real purpose of their dangerous encounter. The Apache leader studied Jake's face in the firelight before responding.
Because Ayana says you are a man who can see truth instead of just believing what others tell you. And, because time grows short for all of us. Iron Shirt explained that major changes were coming to the Apache resistance. Geronimo was planning a final campaign that would either drive the Americans from traditional Apache lands or result in the complete destruction of the remaining free bands. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome would determine the fate of Apache people for generations to come. Many of our young men want to fight until the last warrior falls, Iron Shirt said. They say death is better than life on the reservation where our children forget the ways of their ancestors. Others believe we should negotiate while we still have some strength to bargain. Jake began to understand that he was witnessing an internal Apache debate about survival strategies. Iron Shirt represented those who believed that negotiated settlement might preserve something of Apache culture, while more militant leaders favored resistance regardless of consequences. What role would I play in such negotiations? Jake asked. You could serve as a bridge between our peoples, Iron Shirt replied. Someone who understands both sides and could help find solutions that honor the legitimate needs of all. The proposal was simultaneously flattering and terrifying. Jake understood that attempting to mediate between the army and Apache leaders would place him in extreme danger from both sides. Military authorities would view such activities as treason, while Apache militants would suspect him of serving American interests. Iron Shirt, I appreciate your confidence in me, Jake said carefully. But I'm just a cattleman trying to build a ranch. I have no political authority or influence with military leaders. The Apache leader smiled grimly. You have something more valuable than official authority. You have the ability to see our humanity instead of just our weapons. That is rare among your people. As their conversation continued, Jake learned that Iron Shirt's band was facing impossible choices. Traditional food sources had been disrupted by settlement and cattle ranching. Young warriors were becoming increasingly difficult to control as frustration mounted over broken promises and military pressure. Women and children were suffering from inadequate nutrition and exposure to diseases introduced by contact with non-Apache populations. We cannot continue fighting forever, Iron Shirt admitted. But we cannot accept reservation life that destroys everything our ancestors died to preserve. There must be another way. Jake found himself genuinely moved by the Apache leader's dilemma. Iron Shirt was clearly intelligent and pragmatic, a man seeking solutions rather than simply venting anger. But the forces arrayed against Apache independence seemed overwhelming, and Jake could not imagine any compromise that would satisfy both military demands and Apache cultural requirements. What would acceptable terms look like from your perspective? Jake asked. Iron Shirt outlined a vision that seemed impossibly idealistic given current political realities. He wanted recognition of Apache rights to specific sacred sites, permission to continue traditional hunting and gathering activities in designated areas, and guarantees that Apache children could learn traditional ways alongside reservation schooling. Your people want security and prosperity, Iron Shirt said. We want survival as Apache people rather than just biological existence on reservations. Surely intelligent men can find ways to achieve both goals. Jake admired the logic of Iron Shirt's position while doubting that such compromises were politically possible. American territorial policy seemed focused on complete control rather than accommodation of indigenous rights. Military leaders like Major Williams viewed the Apache as obstacles to be removed rather than people whose legitimate concerns deserved consideration. As dawn approached, Iron Shirt prepared to end their meeting. I do not ask for answers tonight, he said. I ask only that you think about what we have discussed. Perhaps you will see opportunities that others have missed. The Apache leader handed Jake a small piece of turquoise carved in the shape of a bird. This belonged to my grandfather. It will identify you to our people as someone under Iron Shirt's protection. But, use it carefully, carrying it will be seen as proof of collaboration by your soldiers. Jake accepted the token, understanding its significance and danger. Possession of the carved turquoise would indeed constitute evidence of his meeting with Iron Shirt, providing ammunition for anyone seeking to prove his disloyalty to American interests. Will I see Ayana again? Jake asked as Iron Shirt prepared to fade back into the desert darkness.
The Apache leader's expression grew sad. My daughter has learned to care for you more than is wise for either of you. Such feelings between our peoples can only bring pain in times like these. Iron Shirt's words confirmed what Jake had begun to suspect about his relationship with Ayanna. Their conversations had developed emotional dimensions that transcended mere intellectual curiosity. But such personal connections seemed impossible given the political and military realities surrounding them. Be careful, Jake Morrison, Iron Shirt said as he mounted his horse. You stand between two peoples who are moving toward war. Such a position requires wisdom beyond what most men possess. As Jake rode back to his ranch through the pre-dawn darkness, he carried more than just Iron Shirt's warnings and requests. The turquoise token seemed to burn in his pocket like a physical manifestation of the choices confronting him. He could report the meeting to Major Williams and demonstrate his loyalty to American interests. He could attempt to serve as a mediator between the sides and risk being destroyed by both. Or he could flee the territory entirely and leave others to resolve the escalating conflict. Tom Brennan met him at the ranch gate with obvious relief. Glad to see you made it back, boss. Any trouble? Jake shook his head, unwilling to discuss details that might endanger his loyal foreman. But, as he unsaddled his horse and prepared to face another day, he knew that his meeting with Iron Shirt had fundamentally changed his understanding of his situation and his responsibilities. The sun rose over his cattle peacefully grazing along Sulphur Creek, but Jake Morrison could no longer see his ranch as simply a business enterprise. Whether he liked it or not, his property sat at the center of a conflict that would determine the future of the territory and the fate of peoples whose ways of life seemed irreconcilably different. Major Williams would arrive soon with his soldiers to establish the military outpost they had discussed. Jake would have to decide whether to reveal his meeting with Iron Shirt or to keep the Apache leader's secrets. Either choice would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal interests. As he stood on his porch watching the morning light illuminate the mountains where Apache families were making their own desperate decisions, Jake understood that he could no longer remain neutral in a conflict that demanded commitment from everyone it touched. The question was not whether he would have to choose sides, but which side deserved his loyalty and what price he was willing to pay for his decision. The carved turquoise in his pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of Iron Shirt's trust and Ayanna's affection. Whatever he decided, Jake Morrison knew that his choice would echo through the lives of people whose hopes and fears had become entangled with his own in ways he was only beginning to understand.